Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out on this snowy, sleety day. I can only take this as a compliment to our panelists, to our speakers here, whom I'm delighted to introduce. Both of them I like immensely. We have Danny Seidemann from Jerusalem. Danny is an Israeli attorney, and he is an expert on Israeli-Palestinian relations in Jerusalem. He asked me not to expand, but he's a big deal. And interviewing him, we have Robert Wright. Robert Wright is a fellow here at New America. He's also an author of The Evolution of God, Nonzero, and his newest book is called The Moral Animal. He's also a co-founder of Blogging Heads TV, which is this online interviews of very untopical events. And this event is being recorded, video recorded, and it will appear on video on Blogging Heads television. There will be questions afterwards, as usual. We're also recording a podcast. Please remember that when you ask questions, you have to wait for the mic, because otherwise nobody's going to hear you. Now, just before we start the actual event, our co-sponsor for this is the New Israel Fund. And we have here, great honor, David Rosen, who's the Executive Vice President of the New Israel Fund. He's just going to explain very briefly what New Israel does and what their interest is in this event, and then we'll hand it over to the two gentlemen.
Thanks for coming out. I want to thank both Daniel and Robert for joining us this evening. I want to thank our partners at the New America Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with the New Israel Fund, we are the largest funder of social change nonprofits in Israel. We also, in addition to doing grant making, we have the largest capacity building operation in Israel for nonprofits to help the social change movement achieve its goals effectively. We also do recruiting of people who are future leaders of civil society in Israel. And I'd love to encourage you to find out more about us by speaking to me, or there are other New Israel Fund representatives here tonight. We have our main office in Israel, not in Tel Aviv, where you might think we would be, but in Jerusalem, because like New York City, Jerusalem is a place where so many issues show up so intensely for the country, and we are delighted to be partnering and co-sponsoring this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks to all of you for braving the inclement weather. And thanks to Danny, who is indeed a big deal. Possibly the leading authority on the sources of trouble in Jerusalem, I would say, lately. I would like to start by talking just a little about the basics of the facts on the ground and see if my kind of limited understanding of the geography of the situation is right. So if you'll indulge me for like a 60-second summary of my knowledge of the situation, and then tell me what I got wrong or what you'd add. So the green line runs through the heart of Jerusalem. It's West Jerusalem on one side, East Jerusalem on the other. Before the '67 war, the green line was the border of Israel. It is still the internationally recognized border of Israel. It's not so clear that Israel considers it the border of Israel. Israel has not quite annexed East Jerusalem, but it has done something that is considered kind of a quasi-annexation, the legitimacy of which has been basically rejected by the UN, and even the United States does not accept the legitimacy of that. But in any event, so you've got East Jerusalem on one side. That's kind of a hopeful. I like that. And in this context, it's good to have something uplifting. Yeah, I think I've heard it before somewhere. So you've got West Jerusalem, the Jewish part, in Israel proper. East Jerusalem on the other side. Now, within East Jerusalem is the Old City, which includes the Temple Mount. And at the top of the Temple Mount is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a whole mosque compound. Beneath it is the ruins of the ancient Jerusalem Temple. And people probably heard that this has been a source of some dispute, the question of who gets to pray when and so on. And we'll get into that. I would say that's probably one of the main recent drivers of the tension. Another one And as far as I understand, the main other one is some kind of demographic trends in East Jerusalem. There has been slowly but persistently over the last couple of decades or something, the movement of Jewish residents into formerly Palestinian parts of East Jerusalem. This hasn't gone over well with the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And so that's kind of my understanding of things. Is there anything you would correct or add to that?
Not correct, but sort of give additional perspective. Since 1967, everything that Israel has done consistently has been driven by the calculus of national struggle to assure a robust Israeli majority and to create a situation whereby a political division of the cities would be impossible. In 1967, the Palestinians were 25.5% of the population. There were no or very few Palestinians in West Jerusalem, no Israelis in East Jerusalem. Since 1967, Israel has expropriated 35% of the privately owned land in East Jerusalem and rebuilt 53,000 homes for Israelis. So today there are 200,000 Israelis living in the large settlement neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. We have built about 600 homes for Palestinians, the last of which was 1978, if I'm not mistaken, because we have a curious theory that if we don't allow the Palestinians to develop, they will lose interest in sex and child rearing, and they will take up chess. There are two kinds of settlements that you can point out in East Jerusalem. The large settlement neighborhoods, which I've talked about, and settlement enclaves, which are implanted for ideological reasons within existing Palestinian neighborhoods, enclaves. Silwan, Mount of Olives, etc., and they're very, very different, and you have to distinguish between the two. Has Israel succeeded in this enterprise of making the city indivisible and Israeli? There's a mantra. You all know what the mantra is, although you may not know that you know it. The mantra is Jerusalem, the undivided capital of Israel, that will never be redivided, which is one word and an honor. You have to be able to recite it 7 times in a row in order to get elected to Congress. If you put that mantra of an undivided Jerusalem, it's very significant to the reality today, to some sort of reality check. Jerusalem is an Israeli city because it is 2.5 times larger than it's ever been in Jewish history. Last time was 200,000 Jews in the Second Temple period, 508,000 today, but it is emphatically a binational city. There are 303,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem. They are not Israeli. They do not accept the legitimacy of Israeli rule. They've never seen themselves as Israeli, and we've never treated them that way. Jerusalem is a contested city, as you have pointed out. I can show you here and now all of the embassies in Jerusalem. Want to see them again? There are none. And finally, Jerusalem is a divided city because there are de facto borders. But the realities, as you have stated, have changed significantly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, kind of problematically, pretty much everyone who thinks that there's still hope of a two-state solution believes that East Jerusalem, the essence of East Jerusalem would have to be part of the new Palestine. Presumably, if the demographic trends continue, that will become more and more hard to imagine. Now, tensions have gotten worse in recent months. And before we talk about the roots of the tension, why they have gotten worse, can you give us just a couple of reminders, a couple of examples of things that have happened lately that are signs of growing tension between Palestinians and?
You will probably have seen in your press the acute acts of violence, whether it was the abduction and murder of the 3 Israeli teenagers, the horrendous murder of Muhammad Abu Khder, a Palestinian teenager who was abducted during Ramadan in the middle of the night from the stoop outside his father's store and burned alive. You have had vigilante action in the streets of West Jerusalem. You have had terror crossing the line initially on the old border with vehicular terror along the light rail, and then the massacre in the synagogue. But those are only the acute expressions. The Second Intifada has an image of being a horrendously violent event, and it was. And it was dangerous in Jerusalem. The first time my kids got on a bus was when they came to the States, because it was dangerous getting on buses in Jerusalem. But I could wander around East Jerusalem with impunity. I was welcome during the Second Intifada because Jerusalem was the arena, but the Palestinians in East Jerusalem were not participants in the acts of violence in the Second Intifada. There were 270 arrests in all of the 7 years in security-related offenses in East Jerusalem. We'd arrest as many every 2 weeks in the West Bank. That's not the case today. Today, I cannot go into 90% of East Jerusalem without accepting risks I'm not willing to accept. And I'm not squeamish about this. I gauge the dangers rather precisely. My Palestinian friends are very reluctant to come into West Jerusalem or Israeli Jerusalem. When they do so, they will be very hesitant about speaking Arabic. The one question that you asked about the possibility of the two-state solution, if there's any kind of silver lining in the situation, and I'm very reluctant to point this out, if you want to know whether the two-state solution still exists, at least in Jerusalem, the answer is emphatically yes, and it's an answer that the city itself is giving. The border exists. Where Israelis walk, Palestinians don't. Where Palestinians walk, Israelis don't. It's almost binary. There are a number of exceptions. Were Secretary Kerry to be successful, it is precisely where the politicians would have put the border were they to negotiate in good faith, which is something my Prime Minister does not. It's a cognitive border. It does not exist in reality, but it's every bit as efficient as if it were an electrified fence.
Okay. So the Second Intifada was fundamentally a popular uprising in the West Bank. What's happening now, which some people think may be a Third Intifada, is fundamentally in East Jerusalem and not so much in the West Bank, although there is certainly stuff happening in the West Bank. But why the change?
In order to address that issue, you have to look at, I would say, 2 or 3 dimensions. What are the detonators, the triggers that ignite things? And we mentioned Muhammad Abu Khter. And there are others, and what are the underlying causes? Add to that the fuel of a religious conflict on the Temple Mount, and you will get the perfect storm of violence. I'm going to telegraphically just run through a couple of these. We mentioned Muhammad Abu Khter, but Muhammad Abu Khter sits on a couple of things that are they resonate. Number one, this is an intifada that is being led by kids. We have arrested, as opposed to the 270 people arrested in between 2001 and 2007, since July 2nd, the Abu Khter murder, more than 1,300 people, more than 50% are minors, boys, under the age of 18. That means we have arrested more than 0.5% of all Palestinian males under the age of 18. That's huge. They're not being sent by their parents. They're not being sent by this bipolar crackhead Abu Mazen who is inciting them. They haven't read the Washington...
Wait, bipolar crackhead is an interesting term.
He's obviously this charismatic leader who's sending these young Palestinians to encounter the police. I'm saying it, but
I see. So that is the stereotype that you take issue with.
Yeah.
Glad we cleared that up.
Them. And these kids have not read the polling of the Washington Institute saying that the Palestinians East Jerusalem really want to be Israeli. They haven't read those polls yet. Part of it is we are now contemplating, we're going to demolish, or unless the Supreme Court intervenes, the homes of the terrorists who engaged in the synagogue attack, the vehicular attack. And every Palestinian is saying, what about the murderers of Abu Khter's murderers? And the sense is, our blood is water and your blood is blood. Second trigger, and this has to do with why it's erupted in Jerusalem rather than the West Bank. There's an element about our conflict with the Palestinians which is primitive and tribal, among all of us, and none of us are absolved of this. Meron Ben-Vinisi has written very, very compellingly about this. Israelis and Palestinians have not been blessed with Scandinavian temperaments. Let's put it that way. And part of our conflict in Gaza was to inflict as much pain on the Palestinians. It was part of our combat doctrine. include the collateral damage. But the Palestinians wanted to inflict damage on us and were willing to go further than we were. They just weren't successful. So you have this pent-up frustration in Gaza. We haven't been able to stick it to the Israelis to the same extent that they've stuck it to us. So it's like a corked volcano. Where does the lava erupt in a cork volcano? In the West Bank. But you've got Abu Mazen and his security forces sitting on the cork of the volcano. So ironically, the place where it will erupt is in Jerusalem. So those are the triggers of this conflict.
Okay. Now, you were on Blogging Heads TV talking to Sarah Posner not long ago. And there was a tantalizing thing you said, which was that you had played host in Jerusalem to two very prominent Republicans we definitely would have heard of had you named their names. And afterwards, I may try to extract them from you privately, but not right now. You said one was, I gathered, something of either religious leader or someone thought of as religious. One thought of as kind of a military type, very, very prominent. And you said by the end of your the tour, their perspective seemed to have changed a little. I'm wondering what specific things. And you said at the end you thought they were more open to, to further movement, possibly to the left. But what things did they see? What things did you show them that they didn't understand before about Jerusalem that you think made an impact?
I'm going to be a bit snarky and blunt. They were like teenagers at the first outing to a bordello. They had been driven into a parallel universe by certain unnamed lobby groups that punish anybody who deviate from the party line, which talks about an undivided Jerusalem, which, like a unicorn in a child's coloring book, looks lovely but does not exist in nature. Now, these guys that I have been out and around with are right-of-center Republicans, probably not exactly the cup of tea of the fellows here at New America, but they are intelligent and they're patriots, and they have not been allowed to seriously engage the issues that have enormous implications. American lives will be in harm's way if there will be a hemorrhaging conflict in and around the holy sites in Jerusalem. And I had no pretense of convincing them, of converting them. I don't want the support of anybody who I can convince in a 3-hour outing on a Shabbat afternoon. I wanted to pierce their armor, and that happened. And they were engaged, and it's not a question of their not knowing. They knew, but they also were, the whip was cracked, and they were driven into this parallel universe. At the end, one of the senators asked me, all right, what is it that you want from me? I said, I only want one thing. When I talk to my friends in AIPAC, and I'm not using the term euphemistically, I have friends in AIPAC, they agree with me, but they won't even let you think what they say to me behind closed doors. You know damn well that the conversation that we're having on a Saturday afternoon in Jerusalem is politically suicidal in Washington. Make this conversation possible.
You're saying people in AIPAC are secretly as far left as you, or just understand some of the things you understand?
Your enthusiasm.
That was my little moment of uplift for the day. It was short-lived, but I enjoyed it.
I mean, this is going on live, etc. I have a cordial and decent relations with some people I genuinely like, but it's also an unholy alliance. I give them an image of pluralism they don't deserve, and they give me an image of legitimacy I do deserve. It works very well.
Okay. So with these two Republicans, though, was it that they hadn't really grasped that, half of Jerusalem is really fundamentally Palestinian and has been for a long time, or they hadn't understood like the mechanisms by which property is transferred from? What are there specific things they saw that you think made an impact?
There was a very interesting dynamic. When I stopped by the Shepherd's Hotel, which is where President Obama blinked, he insisted on a settlement freeze. He told, through both personally and through Secretary Clinton and Senator Mitchell, don't build a new settlement inside Sheikh Jarrah at Shepherd's Hotel. Netanyahu went ahead and built it, and President Obama looked the other way. And by the way, Washington acted as if there was an artillery bombardment from AIPAC. It wasn't happening. It was a failure of nerve. And when I told them that story, they oozed contempt for the president because apparently they have some unsettled issues with the president. On the other hand, when I asked them, do you want Secretary Kerry to succeed in his efforts in obtaining a two-state solution, they were very deferential. The old boy network works very, very well. And they were as respectful of Secretary Kerry as they were disrespectful in many ways, or not nearly as respectful with the president. And then when you say to them, look, my prime minister is saying, I support the two-state solution, but I oppose any compromise on Jerusalem, I understand that to mean I oppose the two-state solution. What do you think? They found that to be a compelling argument.
Okay. So in terms of the mechanics by which property is transferred from Palestinians to Jews, sometimes it's an actual purchase. I assume the Palestinian owner sells to an Israeli Jew and presumably becomes less popular in the neighborhood thereafter. Sometimes, though, there are these complicated, they look into the history of the land, the legitimacy of the Palestinian ownership is challenged, right? And how does that work? What are the grounds for basically evicting a Palestinian through that avenue?
Okay. I think that what you've done now is misframing the issue. The private purchase is rare. It exists. And even it exists in a market context, which means market is not a relevant term. The large settlement areas, the 200,000, that is the Israeli government taking lands from one sector and transferring it to another, expropriating, taking privately owned land overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly for Palestinians and building for Israelis. That ain't open housing in Chicago.
And on what grounds?
Public purposes and assuring an Israeli capital.
So it's like eminent domain. They're not even
eminent domain. But again, this cuts to the core of why Jerusalem is on fire and aflame every night. The law allows government to take properties for public purpose, but there's only one public in Jerusalem, and it's the Israeli public, and the Palestinians are not a public. They are permanently disenfranchised. They don't have the right to vote.
We'll have a question and answer period, and I officially designate you the first questioner.
So that's number one. Number two, the authorities of government have been used to implant the additional settlers in enclaves. One vehicle, one war in 1948. Jews lost property in Sheikh Jarrah. Israeli legislation allows for Jews to recover those property. That is the core of the settlement in Sheikh Jarrah and a few other places, not huge. There are rumors to the effect that there were a number of Palestinians who also lost property in 1948, 600,000 or 700,000 strong. Some of them lived down the block. They lost it in the same war, and they may not recover their property. So that is another vehicle. Third vehicle, absentee property. Any Palestinian who was any area in the Arab world outside of Jerusalem at any point after 1967 loses his property to the state, and it's turned over to the Jewish people. And the Jewish people is 5'4" tall and has a mustache and he's a settler. Okay?
And how do they determine which Jewish person gets the property?
Virtually, again, it's a great question. This is usually not about restoring the property to the original owner. It's about restoring, it happens on occasion, and in one of the mechanisms, but it's about restoring it to this Jewish people, and the Jewish people is invariably a very small ideological sector of Israeli society. All government properties in Silwan, City of David, and Muslim Quarter of the Old City have been transferred en bloc without any other public scrutiny to extreme settler organizations. None of these properties have been put at the disposal of the public at large. None of them have been put at the disposal of an existing Palestinian population.
Nope.
In addition to that, there are private purchases. There are.
Okay. One more question about the kind of residential patterns in East Jerusalem before we turn to the Temple Mount. Talk a little about this thing called the David Foundation.
There are a small number of settler organizations, small in number, very consequential in impact. One in the Muslim Quarter, principally called the Terrestrial, the other called El Ad, which is principally in Silwan, the City of David, which is immediately to the south of the ramparts of the Old City.
Okay. And El Ad is the David Foundation?
Is the City of David Foundation.
Okay.
They've decided to go motherhood and apple pie, so they no longer call themselves El Ad, they call themselves the City of David Organization. Their goal, and I'm using terminology, it's very strange. I have a cordial relationship with the settlers in Silwan, even though I've spent the last 23 years bloodying them in court and trying to prevent them from taking over the houses. Israel's a curious place, okay? And they told me our goal is to transform the existing area of Wadi Khilwit, which is about a 30-acre-sized area, in Silwan, City of David, which is indeed biblical Jerusalem more than the old city itself. And what we have seen is a total blurring of the public domain and the private domain, governmental and non-governmental. Many of the authorities of government have been outsourced to the settlers. You go to the most important archaeological site in the country, you pay, and you will get a receipt from the Elad or settler organizations. It's sort of like paying a visit to the National Armory and getting a receipt from the NRA. The NRA is legitimate, but you don't exactly want to deposit the family jewels with them. In addition, you have the settler DNA injected into government. And my criticism here, more than it's against the settlers, it's against the government of Israel. People in the Israeli left whine about how Israeli democracy is going down the tubes, and we do have a fragile democracy. I tend to think that Israel has a feisty but very flawed democracy in Israel proper. When you enter Silwan, Israeli democracy morphs into a regime.
Okay. On the Temple Mount, there's been a lot of discussion about preserving the status quo, which I gather means that Jews are not allowed to pray. They can go, but they can't pray. They can pray on the Western Wall of the old temple, but they can't pray on the top. They can visit. And that's been the situation since 1967. Why is that being challenged more than before? Why the sudden tension over that?
Okay, you've described the situation very well. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, I have no intention of changing the status quo on the Temple Mount. He also says he supports the two-state solution, but in the case of the Temple Mount, I believe him. Okay? But I also believe that what he is saying is very inadequate, and I can explain that by 3 vignettes. What was the status quo on the Temple Mount during the British Mandate between 1922 and May of 1948? There was no status quo, because status quo applies only to sites that are contested. And during the entire mandatory period, there were no Jewish claims to access or do anything on the Temple Mount. We had deep attachments. There were contested sites. The Western Wall was contested. Rachel's tomb was contested. You Christians have a dog in this fight. The most visceral conflicts in the city of Jerusalem are in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then you've got the Church of the Nativity. But it was not relevant, okay? Fast forward. The situation that you described of the Temple Mount being accessible to non-Muslims, but exclusively a place of worship, didn't start in 1967. It started at the end of the Crimean War, where the Ottoman Empire opened up towards the west. So you had Jews like Moses Montefiore and Sir Baron Rothschild going to visit the Mount. They would go in a sedan so they wouldn't step foot on the Temple Mount. We're good at these things. Fast forward. In 1980, I'm in the IDF. I'm an officer in the Army, and I would, on a few occasions, accompany Israeli officers under my command to visit the Temple Mount. At that point, there was an entrance fee, and I would have to pay. Now, I would go there with a booklet of payment vouchers with the seal of the Israeli Ministry of Defense, step aside, and the Waqf, the guard of the Islamic Endowment, would fill it out. We would stamp it. He would get one copy. I'd get one. I'd send one to Tel Aviv. It was cordial, respectful. They needed me like a case of herpes. I was still an occupier, but it was respectful. Fast forward again. Israel has a minister of construction by the name of Uri Ariel, who's responsible for the settlement enterprise under Netanyahu, and he's a Temple Mounter. His cabinet says no prayer on the Temple Mount. The Shin Bet says no prayer on the Temple Mount. He goes there and he prays. Now, you can pray quietly and nobody will know. But you may have noticed in international flights that the ultra-Orthodox may not pray under 30,000 feet because it does not sufficiently annoy the other passengers. It's not enough that you pray. It has to be aggravated devotion. So Uri Ariel has to make sure that everybody knows he's praying. He does the priestly blessing. And then he goes on camera and says, I would be delighted in my capacity as Israel's Minister of Construction to see the third temple built. That is, he's not a kibbutzer like me. He's the Minister of Construction. To what do I compare this? Netanyahu is right. The hours of visiting the Temple Mount have not changed. No prayer has not changed. The authorities of the Waqf has not changed. But, this institution of open houses where people are allowed into private homes or offices that are architectural gems. 1980, when I went in, I went in, the people didn't exactly like it, but it was respectful, cordial, we went away. Today, they're going in and saying, hey, in a loud voice, it's not clear whether we're going to get rid of half of you or all of you. We're going to be doing major renovations, and you take out the tape measure and measure for the new drapes. 20 years ago, the Temple Mount was not a contested site. Today, it is a contested site, the quintessential contested site, even though the formal status quo has not changed. And I fault Netanyahu not so much for his policies, but for failing to rein in the pyromaniacs in his own midst. And that's the real danger of Jerusalem. I have a curious tastes. And there's one day in Jerusalem that I've decided that I'd like. This is my favorite day. It's Chol HaMoed Sukkot. It's during the middle days of Sukkot. You have the evangelical, dispensationalist, end-of-days Christians in town celebrating, calling for the construction of the third temple. You have the temple mounters trying to access the Temple Mount to see if they can get away with praying. And then you've got the Shabiba starting to pick up their rocks and the Molotov cocktails. It's God is in heaven and you have an egalitarian Jerusalem. One day, Jewish pyromaniacs, Christian pyromaniacs, and Muslim pyromaniacs. It's a delight.
Sounds inviting.
Come, I'll show it to you.
Yeah, I've been, but not on that day. So this is, in a way, is this a manifestation? The fact that there have been more challenges to the status quo on the Temple Mount, is that just a manifestation of a deeper movement to the right within Israel? I mean, I'm sure there have always been people who would like to contest the status quo, but apparently they're feeling their oats now in a way that they weren't.
This movement emerged immediately after 1967. The guy that led it was the IDF Rabbi Goren, and there have been unconfirmed reports that he wrote in his diaries he wanted to blow up the mosques. Not confirmed. That was marginal in 1967. What was marginal then has become mainstream, at least in the Israeli right. Netanyahu is a minority in his own party on this issue. But to be fair, these are also trends that we've been witnessing in the Christian world and in the Muslim world. The traditional churches, Latin, Orthodox, etc., the chief rabbis and halakhic position on prayer on the Temple Mount, and traditional Muslim positions have understood that Jerusalem is going to have to speak in multiple voices. What we have been witnessing is the marginalization of the traditional faith communities and the ascendancy of those people who weaponize faith. So you have Messianic Jews with Messianic aspirations on the Temple Mount to rebuild the temple. You have Sarah Palin who can see the Temple Mount from her front porch. And then you've got the nastier wing of the Brotherhood. And they support each other because each for their own agenda aspire to a religious war. And those saying keep religion out of Jerusalem is like saying keep culture out of Florence and the canals out of Venice. The problem is not religion, it's the ascendancy of those people who weaponize religion.
Right. And when you say the supremacists, extremists in the different, and actually supremacists in some cases, but, or supremacists, when you say they support each other, you don't mean explicitly embrace each other's agenda, you mean they strengthen each other. I mean, the more radical one sounds, the more of a market there is for radicalism in the other faith. So they're playing a non-zero-sum game among themselves successfully.
Look at Abu Mazen, who's had some, Mahmoud Abbas, the president, has some unfortunate statements. In Washington, a couple of years ago, Abu Mazen said to Jewish leaders, I know you're not in the land of Israel and Jerusalem by accident. Namely, an anti-Arafat claim, I recognize your attachments. And that's critical. And today he's speaking the language these people are defiling the sanctity of the Temple Mount because this radicalization is compelling him to speak in ways that he didn't speak in the past. I regret that, but it's happening.
And what would you say to a question that I assume would be posed by some conservative Jews and some conservative Christians probably, which is, well, what's wrong with equal time on the Temple Mount? Well, I mean, after all, both faiths have an historical claim to the place. You know, prior to 1500 or 1600 years ago, there was no mosque, and beneath where there are now mosques, there was indeed the temple. So, on historical grounds, you could say that they have equal claims. How much damage does it do for somebody of another faith to come up and briefly pray? What is your answer to that?
Uri Ariel, our Minister of Construction, in his new role is Rosa Parks. You're asking a really important question because a lot of the discourse has been those who say this is a First Amendment issue, and those who say, you know something, the Temple Mount people are really right. They should be able to pray, but they're Muslims. They're crazy. They have this murderous streak. I don't buy that. Okay, and the reason I said pointed out what was happening during the Mandate, there have not been practical Jewish claims on the Temple Mount for 1,000 years. It's a Muslim place of worship. You're saying, okay, because rabbinic opinion has changed in certain places, we have to change the character of something that is dear to us. Chabad, all of a sudden, Lubavitcher will decide they want to do some outreach in the Holy See. So you're going to have a Chabad house in the Vatican? Come on. Palestinians can enter the Western Wall Plaza? No. That's number one. Number two, I've been arguing for years that what's happening in the Temple Mount is not a religious freedom, it's a national, regional, and global security issue. And my allies on this in the American government have not been in the White House and the State Department. They've been in the Pentagon, because the generals in the Pentagon have been going into regional political offices for the last 20 years, and what they see on the wall behind the heads of their host is Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock. And they understand that the relationship of the Arab and Muslim world to the West depends in many ways how people see themselves vis-a-vis the Temple Mount. A sense of violation is dangerous. This isn't, there's a great Talmudic saying, even if this were a First Amendment case, Lo charva Yerushalayim ela mipnei shedanu badin Torah. Jerusalem was not destroyed except for an overly rigorous application of the law of the Torah. Caution.
Okay. Now, you said that this time around, in what may or may not be a third intifada, the tension is more focused in Jerusalem than last time around. I guess it may be evidence that this tension has been building slowly, that I gather you were yourself assaulted while visiting a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. You were visiting a Palestinian friend. You were driving away. You were stuck in traffic. Somebody put, I gather, a large rock through your window and into your head, and it was a non-trivial wound. Generally when we don't know who did it, presumably it was a best bet on the odds would be a young male Palestinian, probably. Generally when people do things like that, they don't think they're doing a bad thing. They have a reason, and if you ask them why they did that to somebody, they would be able to come up with a justification. Do you have a guess as to what, if I pressed that young Palestinian or any other comparable young Palestinian, what kind of the first few sentences out of their mouth would be?
Let me give you the first few sentences, and then I'll engage in a bit of reductionism. That's what I'm here for, okay? Reductionism. He'd say, he's an occupier. Doesn't matter whether he's nice, he's not nice. One of the most embarrassing things was the following day, the leaders, the traditional leaders of the village came to apologize, and they didn't know what to do with it. I'm an occupier. I don't deserve any dispensation. I oppose the violence. The violence is hideous, but I have no special immunities, and I was perceived as an occupier. And today, I've been back to that neighborhood, which is a mile from my house. I haven't been back there since July 2nd, and I won't go until things quiet down. A couple of reductionist observations. Since 2000, Israel has crushed every form of political expression in East Jerusalem more radical than a scout meeting, and we also have crushed scout meetings. And when you crush legitimate forms of protest, I think this is a variation on the theme of Robert Kennedy, you leave the field open for the people who don't ask permission, and that is clearly happening. There's also another thing here which I want to point out, because this isn't a morality play. A Palestinian colleague of mine, somebody probably most of you know the name, one of the keenest observers of Palestinian political culture. We both read the same book at the same time and ended up having a cup of coffee and finding that out. It was a book by Tom Segev on the British Mandate called One Palestine Complete. Highly recommended, riveting book. And my friend said, I want to sum up the book in the following way. You Jews and the Yishuv, later Israelis, you made the lives of the British Mandate miserable all day, every day. It wasn't pretty. Sometimes it was violent. But you guys were like a low-grade fever. We Palestinians were pliable, courteous, obsequious, servile, until periodically we broke out into a murderous rage. And that is also the case. The Palestinians of East Jerusalem are not predisposed to violence, and they have not been the vanguard of Palestinian resistance to occupation. But the perfect storm of events have led them to say, we're fed up. We don't count. We are Arab. We are run by a government that treats us at best with apathy, at worst as an alien hostile population. They've gone into this conflict feeling alienated, and they're emerging from this conflict feeling as if they're enemies of the state and the state is not theirs. And that has set off this violent round. And it was bubbling under the surface before July 2nd. It didn't come totally as a surprise.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you see this kind of behavior, attacks on people, which sometimes are even lethal, as a not surprising consequence of people who have been in a certain situation for long enough, which isn't to say it's morally defensible. Leave the culpability question aside, but you seem to think it just shouldn't shock us when this stuff happens. I assume that's not a super common view in Israel. And let me ask you, well, certainly there are people who don't hold it in Israel, and a fair number of them. Let me ask you, have you ever had success in kind of taking someone who didn't have that view, who just didn't get it in the sense that you think you do, and getting them to put themselves in the shoes of a young male Palestinian, explain to them the circumstances and so on, and have them see the light?
You make me sound like a missionary.
Well, we need missionaries.
Anybody can throw away their crutches here or something like that? All right. I highly recommend not speaking in stereotypes. Take a look at our president. Watch him. He's interesting. He's the genuine item, and there are distant rumblings of greatness there. He's not a two-stater like me, and diminishing him but he is, he very much understands why the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are engaged in what they're engaged. That's number one. Number two, look, I don't do this. I do this as infrequently as possible, but I go out and around and show people geopolitical Jerusalem. And I've done it with Republican senators, but I've also done it with Shas leaders, and I've done it with people from the pragmatic right. Nobody walks away unaffected. They do with it what they do with it, but the realities are so compelling, so interesting, so convincing, and so superior to these two-dimensional myths of a non-existent Jerusalem. Yes, people are affected. Finally, take a look at the response of official Israel. And the response of official Israel, I would say, coming from Netanyahu and our mayor Barakat. And their response is derivative of their axiomatic, almost Jesuit belief in a non-existent United Jerusalem. Because they believe in a United Jerusalem, they are entirely detached from the empirical realities of the city. You cannot imagine a more divided city. How can you talk about being united? As a result of that, for them, East Jerusalem is as it should be. Jerusalem is as it should be, and the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are living in an optimal situation. They could not have it better. And if they are engaged in acts of violence, it derives from one of three reasons. They're ingrates. We give them social welfare benefits and health care, and they throw stones, or they're gullible and incited by Abu Mazen, or they're inherently criminal. As a result of that, they are incapable of listening to genuine concerns. What are they trying to tell us? They're committed to a Jerusalem that doesn't exist. Nowhere on the planet is there a national leader and a mayor of a national capital more detached from the empirical realities of the city they purport to run than Netanyahu and Barakat in relation to Jerusalem. And as a result of that, the only policy they have is, we're going to break them. These are not people to be engaged. These are not people to be mollified. These are people to be broken. And therefore, we're seeing the ascendancy of a much more endemic collective punishment in East Jerusalem, the likes of which we haven't seen before.
Okay, final question before we open it up for Q&A. You said you are a two-stater. I would say there are a growing number of people who think it's too late for a two-state solution. I've kind of made that argument myself, and I guess the essence of the argument is that if you look in the West Bank at the entrenched settler population, and look at the political support there is for the settlers to kind of extract enough settlers, enough settlements for a two-state solution would require a degree of political will that I haven't seen in Israel. And compounding this and kind of, supplementing this analysis is something that Daniel Levy, a friend of mine, a friend of yours, told me when I was in Israel, actually. He said the problem is when you have times like this of tremendous tension, the Israelis are so frightened, and we should emphasize, there is genuine fear. Yeah, and the Second Intifada would have, and I want to stop and say that Israel's reaction to this, in my view, to all of this, has been no more irrational than America's reaction to 9/11, in my view. I don't applaud either reaction, but it seems to be kind of a human reaction under certain kinds of threat. And anyway, what Daniel said is that when times are hard, yeah, you can get them to say, boy, a two-state solution would be nice, but at those times they're so frightened, they don't trust the Palestinians enough to do a two-state deal. Whereas then when things calm down, they're not highly motivated enough. Things are good in Tel Aviv. What's the problem? So we'll try to just briefly, before we go to Q&A, talk me out of the pessimism.
Number one, I'm not sure I can.
I'm sure you can't, but try.
Let's do this in stages. We know today, I think with a fairly high degree of accuracy, where the potential border lies. It's not 100%, but it's about a 3% tolerance. It's in that zone of possible agreement that you conceivably can have an Israeli leader and a Palestinian leader conceivably agreeing to that. In 2007, I briefed a kid in jeans who was surrounded by 6 guys in $3,000 suits. And I was talking to the suits because obviously they're important. I should have been talking to the kid in jeans. It was David Cameron, who was then head of the British opposition. I met him again in March of this year, and his first question to me was, what has changed in the 7 years since I've been here? And I can give you a fairly definitive answer. 7 years ago, it would have required the relocation of 100,000 Israeli settlers to arrive at that border. Today, the number is about 150,000. It's growing by 10,000 a year. The 10,000 number is growing exponentially. And so, yeah, and at some point there's a tipping point. Nobody will be able to tell you with authority when that tipping point is reached. Now, I consider myself in a diminishing minority of people who take the question seriously. I'm outflanked by postmodernists of two kinds. There are those who say the two-state solution is dead as a doornail. Usually they're made up of 3 people: the settler right in Israel, who never accepted the legitimacy of Palestinian claims, the Palestinian left, who never accepted the legitimacy of Israel, and people in a foul mood who get up in the morning, there's no two-state solution, they have 2 drinks and it comes back. Then, on the other side, you have the postmodernists like Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller, who say not only is the two-state solution not dead, it's immortal. What goes up can come down. No. And they share something, both of these. They both say what happens on the ground doesn't matter. One because it's too late, and the other because there's no clock. Okay? I say what happens on the ground matters. I agree with you, and I'm very concerned. Now the Israeli approach. I agree with him completely. For me, it's impossible to talk about the Israeli approach to settlements because we're such a tribal people. There are different Israelis. But you're pointing out something. I believe there's one thing on the Israeli side, ignoring the Palestinian side for the moment, which is a greater obstacle to a political process with settlements, and those are the cafes in Tel Aviv and the malls in Rishon LeZion. We are sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano. Most Israelis, I believe, approach occupation in a way that's similar to Thomas Jefferson's quip on slavery. Slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You're scared to hold on, and you don't dare let go. And we have rational fears, and we have irrational fears. Regrettably, we have a prime minister who plays on Israeli angst and fears the way a virtuoso plays on a Stradivarius. That is what these elections are going to be about. There have been protracted periods in our history, the last 47 years, in which occupation has been a disease in remission. It was bearable. It wasn't ugly. We are now in the opposite situation. It's in the aggressive stage. It's metastasizing. And what we will be confronting in these elections, I would hope, is Israel going to be a ghetto with an army, am levadad yeshkon, in a tribal conflict, or a flawed nation state with a majority of Jews and Zionists? That's the referendum. I hope that will be the issue in this elections. If it is, no, all bets are off. But I don't think it's a lost cause.
Okay. So let's open it up to questions. I encourage you to make your questions actual questions. You may need a sentence to set the context for a question, but beyond that, please no extended statements. Now, do you still have a question?
Sure.
Okay. And always wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. These are very short, factual questions. Does the eminent domain function come with compensation? Is it legitimate compensation?
The answer is a great question, and the answer is yes, there's compensation. It's completely irrelevant because the Palestinians will never accept it. Because the Palestinians are saying, we as Palestinians will accept entitlements and rights from Israel only to the extent that it will not signal the acquiescence to the legitimacy of Israeli rule. We don't want our compensation. We want sumud. We want to hold on, and we're not going to be bought. Okay? You see the same things in the mayoral elections. Palestinians can't vote in national elections. They're not citizens. They don't have passports. But they may vote in municipal elections. And our mayor constantly is saying, in the name of all of the residents who elected me as their mayor, I'm a nudnik and I check. I went to the polling places and cracked the figures. There were elections in October of 2013. There were more than 157,000 eligible Palestinian voters. Of them, 1,101 cast a ballot. That is worse than Kansas, Dorothy. 561 out of 157,000 voted for Mayor Barkat, and that empowers him to speak in the name of all of the residents of Jerusalem. 561. Find a mishpocha. I know the family. They work in the family. Great people. It's based on a fiction. They are not, Palestinians are not Israelis. Palestinian citizens of Israel in the Galilee, in Nazareth, they are not. And they will not, they pay a huge price for not voting. Politicians never allocate resources, entitlements, or time to people who don't vote, but they will not sell their national identities for a ballot. Full stop.
Yes.
Just very briefly, I'm curious how much American funding is coming to organizations like Elad, or what's the other one? The mayor.
Kohanim, things of that nature.
There's another one, Sarah something or other, that the mayor was indicted for yesterday.
Oh, Yad Sarah. I'm not familiar with Yad Sarah. They do good work. I only follow the bad people. The answer is that nobody really knows, because you have moderate, I think we use left-wing, moderate organizations living under the magnifying glass. You're an agent of this hostile power called Great Britain. You're receiving funding from them. The settlers have been absolved of revealing the sources of their donations for security reasons, which is very curious, because the friends of the settler organizations in the United States are required by the IRS to reveal their donations. It's safe to reveal sources of funding for settlements in the United States. It's not safe to do so in Israel. It's nonsense. My intuitive feel is this is all GOI, Government of Israel. There is significance of funding coming from certain individuals, and you've had Moskowitz of Miami, Florida, the Bingo King, engaged in this in the past. No, this is overwhelmingly the authorities, the powers, and the budgets of the Government of Israel. This is not private enterprise. But again, nobody that I know has the precise figures.
Okay, in the hat.
Hi, thank you. So you diagnosed what the problem is, but I just want to understand what the solution is. And my question is, you said there's over 200,000 people living in East Jerusalem. So what is your proposal like to cities like Har Homa, French Hill, Pisgat Zev? And also, do you propose that it should, once you figure out what East Jerusalem is, to build a huge wall separating and have no connection?
And for those of us who don't know, French, are those things you listed Jewish enclaves within East Jerusalem? Actual settlements. Okay.
Okay. I was asked by people with authority in Washington to do an interesting enterprise and to examine what has been learned by us, people involved in this, about permanent status Jerusalem that we didn't know in the summer of 2000 at Camp David. I mean, this is something that's very uncustomary for attorneys. You can get disbarred for this is original thinking. And I discovered some interesting stuff. Number one, any leader, Israeli or Palestinian, who has negotiated in this good faith has pretty much arrived at the same border. Okay? The issue of where to put the border in Jerusalem is not in large part disputed. There is a dispute about one of the neighbors that you've mentioned. I don't make light of it. Har Choma. I can build a border without it. I can build a border with it. It's a very complicated issue, but the solution's simple. So counterintuitively, the border is not the major issue. The major issue is how do you integrate the respective cities into Palestine on the one hand and to Israel on the other. And there the gap is very wide, but that is the issue that is most amenable to compromise. And we know where the zone of possible agreement is there. The third issue, there isn't one resolution to the issue, is the issue of the old city and perhaps its environs. And here you have 2.5 possibilities. And by the way, you can find Israelis and Palestinians supporting each of these. On the one hand, you have the Clintonian approach, divide sovereignty in the old city as well. And that is the direction that Ehud Barak went in accepting the Clinton parameters, and that's the direction that Abu Mazen has gone in his approach in the ideas floated in and around Annapolis. The UN and some others, including Olmert, have said no division of sovereignty, but a special regime. No sovereignty to anybody. Olmert's model was the old city and its environs being operated by a steering committee made up of the United States, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. There's an excellent working group of Canadians that did a very interesting project in that. Both of these models have huge advantages and major, major drawbacks. Neither of these models exists in purity in nature. In all likelihood, it will be in a continuum between the two. But when somebody comes to you and says, Jerusalem is a radioactive, it's too difficult, it's too complicated, your question should be, why does this person have a vested interest in the perpetuation of the conflict? It's not nuclear science. Will there be a border? Yes, it will be a border, and it will initially be an impermeable border. It will not be a virtual border, but it will not be a wall. It won't be pretty, but it won't be ugly. It won't mortally scar the city. I can guarantee you that the day the border in Jerusalem, this conflict ends when occupation ends. Occupation ends in one way. It ends in a border, in the two-state solution. Now, it may be that the two-state solution is impossible, but destroying the two-state solution does not create an alternative. It will create a perpetual occupation. That border will be real. I will need to present a passport to visit friends in Shuafat and the refugee camp. Having said that, the day the border goes up, it will begin to unravel. Life will take over. The idealized will start to move to the backseat, and Jerusalem will begin to heal. But the reconciliation will not even begin until the divorce is completed, and the divorce is aborted.
Okay, why don't we move man in the beret? Move from a baseball cap to a beret and see if...
A basic question which there's alarmingly little clarity on, which I hope that you can explain. Okay, Israel has claimed to have annexed East Jerusalem since 1967. Mm-hmm. But the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not actually citizens of Israel. Unlike the Palestinians in Galilee, they cannot vote in the national elections. Yet They can vote in the municipal elections of the city of Jerusalem.
And don't.
So, I'm sorry?
And don't.
Choose not to.
They choose not.
And do not, for the most part. Yes. But so what exactly is their legal status, and what's the justification for denying them full citizenship rights if, in fact, East Jerusalem has been, quote unquote, annexed?
Okay. The permanent, their status is one of permanent resident. Permanent resident is a status that was created for somebody who lives permanently in a country but without being a citizen of it. And it's usually done for in sui generis situations. But this is now has been applied to the Palestinian collective. And I believe that to be the most consequential decision made by Israel since 1967. In 1949, we did not ask the Palestinians in the Galilee, do you want to be Israelis? We imposed our citizenship. Annexation is annexation. We did not do that. Now, when you say what justification, we don't want the binational city. And what we're seeing today in Jerusalem is the city of Jerusalem is collapsing under the weight of its own fictions. Israeli governance, based on this model of a permanently disenfranchised collective, is not sustainable. Who's that? 300,000 Palestinians, and it's happening. Now, when you say Israel denied citizenship, that's not entirely correct. It's half correct. We never offered it, and the Palestinians never wanted it. It was a very convenient arrangement. This is mutual. It's not as if the Palestinians are clamoring at the door and saying, give us equal rights. They don't. They don't. Now, you will be told often the Palestinians have the right to get citizenship. Wrong. They have the right to ask for it, and we have the right to say no. The right of a Palestinian to apply for citizenship is equal to the right of a Peruvian minister, etc. We have the hard figures that were secret for many years. Slightly more than 10,000 Palestinians since 1970 have asked for citizenship. Slightly more than 5,000 have received it. On the order of 8,000 of the East Jerusalemites are citizens out of 303,000 Palestinians. It's a drop in the bucket. You do have another few thousand Israeli citizens who moved from the Galilee, mostly for government positions. But those who are citizens, the numbers are of anecdotal value, and the situation is not changing because the dynamic is such, and that basically creates an inherently dysfunctional Israeli government in East Jerusalem. That's what this uprising is about. We don't count. We Palestinians don't count. We have, why are the kids in open revolt? They don't read the Wall Street Journal, and they're, and what the real sense of it is, our parents aren't delivering to us the fundamental thing that every parent owes his kid, and that's a future. We have no future, and that is the feeling on the streets, and they're right.
So the energy is coming from younger and younger people, innocent, compared to past intifadas. They're losing patience, not just with the Israelis, but with their own kind of parents. Let's go back to way back, for the sake of.
Since the two-state solution seems to be mostly talked about in think tanks and supported by fewer and fewer actual people, what are the options? What are the alternatives to a two-state solution down the road, 50 years from now? If there's still not another two-state solution, what will Israel look like?
There is a one-state consequence. There is not a one-state solution. The fibers of both national movements is self-determination. Until 4 months ago, I was out in the streets of East Jerusalem for the last 23 years. Israelis and Palestinians do not aspire to share societies. So you can destroy the two-state solution. Destroying the two-state solution does not create an alternative out of the ashes. It creates a reality that will be perpetually hemorrhaging, Belfast at its worst. Jerusalem is a very wise city, and it's very kind to those people who treat her complexities with the dignity that it deserves. And it's one nasty town for those who abuse it. listen to what Jerusalem is telling us. Look at Jerusalem, what Jerusalem's showing us today. It is showing us that the two-state solution is possible because the 800,000, most of the 800,000 people in Jerusalem are living the border of the two-state solution today, even though it's messy and violent and not politicized. But Jerusalem is also showing us the one-state consequence. 4 or 5 months ago, you would go to the city of David and you would have this pseudo, kumbaya, shucks, we just get along well with our Palestinian neighbors. They knock on the door and you give them a cup of sugar and you get along fine. You now have the settlers moving in and out of Silwan and convoys. They've stopped counting the Molotov cocktails to which they've been subjected. The settlement enclaves are an armed camp overnight. Within hours of the outbreak of violence, Jerusalem, the enclaves have been Hebronized. So this is a tale of two cities, not only in terms of an Israeli city and a Palestinian city. Today, you can see with fair approximation what the two-state solution looks like. You can also see where we're heading if we lose it.
So you would call the kind of left-wing version of the one-state solution just naive in its hopes for the two people getting along within a single state?
There's a one-state reality, a one-state consequence. There is no one-state solution.
Okay, yes, right there. Okay, a number of people have their hands up.
You touched upon the U.S. role in the past a little bit, mentioning certain players. What, if any, role do you think the U.S. should be playing in this conflict going forward? If you do.
It's a great question. I deal with one issue. I've got a sandbox. And my sandbox is 70 square kilometers. It's East Jerusalem. But playing in that sandbox also gives you a front row seat on one of the more consequential issues of regional and global significance. So I sort of get an interesting view of this. And one of the keenest observers that I know, a senior European diplomat in Tel Aviv, probably the best, got together with me the day after the collapse of the Kerry talks. And he said, it's now evident, what we suspected, that the era of American ownership of the Israel-Palestine political processes is over. That this is not going to be a deal, if there will be a deal, that will be exclusively a deal brokered by a paternal United States between Israelis and Palestinians. That does not mean negotiations are inconsequential. It does not mean that American leadership is not critical, but nobody knows what American leadership looks like these days because things are changing and we don't know what it looks like, and that includes the leadership of the United States. What we're seeing is the emergence of a more multipolar world. American engagement on this is critical. Israelis need doses of reality, and given the lenses of domestic American politics, those doses of reality coming from Washington are few and far between. But we are now seeing the emergence of the significance of European powers. Keep a close watch on the French initiative in the United Nations. They are bringing the British and the Germans along quietly. The United States is examining how to relate to this. Look at the internationalization. Look at criminalization. There are potential war crimes here, things of that nature. I think that the old order is dead. That means American ownership. The new order is not yet in place. I think we're seeing from the midst some of the components now emerging. It's really an interesting period.
Okay, I've been given the 5-minute warning. I remember 3 hands up from the last time. What I'm going to ask you to do is quickly, the three of you, I'm going to note, quickly ask a question in succession, and then we'll have Danny answer all 3 questions. David? Yeah. And then woman in beige, and then you.
Yeah, so if the border were to be permanently drawn, the one that you say is generally agreed upon, presumably there would be Jews on the other side of it. And I'm curious if you could expand on... There won't be any... You can draw a border that's completely contiguous, that will have no Jews on the wrong side?
Okay.
And my question is, what will happen?
Okay, let's get all three questions, and then because I have a severe taskmaster who gave me the 5-minute warning, I might be fired.
Mine relates to his. So you've talked about the Israeli leadership. Maybe could you talk about the Palestinian leadership and what they could do to help this two-state solution?
Okay, and finally?
An Israeli Jewish peacenik friend who resides in Jerusalem, who of course agrees with you and me that a two-state solution requires a divided Jerusalem, tells me that your solution for a divided Jerusalem requires rigid separation between Palestinians and Jews. A separation requiring walls, fences, and tunnels. Can I tell him that he's wrong?
No.
Okay, so why don't you start with him, and then we'll do that.
For me, the availability of a two-state solution breaks down to a specific calculus. I got maps on my laptop. Can I put a ballpoint pen at the top of the map and draw one contiguous line that will carve out a robust contiguous Palestinian capital integrated into Palestine, leave in its wake an equally contiguous, robust Israeli capital, a border in which no Israeli will be required to see a Palestinian policeman on his way home because we fear for our security and we have for what? And no Palestinian will be required to see an Israeli border patrol person on the way home because they are under the thumb of occupation and they have for what? I can do that today. I will not be able to do it a year or a year and a half from now, should the current trends continue, and that is my concern. Givat Matos is the most prominent of these, and that's why it's received as much attention as it has. And that's number one.
That was my question.
I'm answering his question. I'm leaving you for the last. You deserve the best question. Remind me of your...
question. You talked about Israeli leadership. What could
Okay,
Palestinian
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has done a great service to Abu Mazen and is absolving Abu Mazen of answering similar questions. Look, between the beginning of August in 2013, when Kerry was able to jumpstart the negotiations, and the collapse of those negotiations, there were more settlement announcements, real ones, in East Jerusalem than there were in the previous 4 years put together. At the same time, Tzipi Livni, our top negotiator, underwent every possible humiliation short of have the car home by 7 o'clock. She was not allowed to talk, not borders, not maps, and not Jerusalem. So it was evident that the borders between Israel and Palestine and the status of Jerusalem were being dictated outside of the negotiating room, not inside the negotiating room. And that's what led to the collapse of the talks. The Palestinians did put proposals on the table, which were not acceptable, but they were there. Hair will sprout on the palms of my hand before Netanyahu does so. I firmly believe, basing myself on Harris and others, that Abu Mazen is very much a partner, knowing what he has proposed. Does that lead me to believe that he would go the distance? The answer is no. I don't know, and we will only know when we put it to the test. I am convinced he would go the distance on the question of borders. I am convinced he would go the distance on the questions of security and things of that nature. The enormity of the transformation of right of return and refugees is such that I have my doubts. I don't know Abu Mazen. I'm not deeply steeped in Palestinian political culture, but I have good friends who are his advisors. And I asked them, would Abu Mazen go the distance? And their response is, we think so, but we will only know when it's put to the test. So yes, there is an open question, but again, that can only be done after serious negotiations in good faith. Look, on the question of hard walls, barbed wire, things of that nature, tunnels, let me distinguish between the aesthetics and the substance. the Palestinians would love to drive us into the sea to drown. We would love to drive them into the Jordanian desert to die of thirst. Neither of those options is available. The two-state solution is the closest approximation. This is not being driven by Isaiah, lions, and lambs. This is an attempt to get rid of one another. There will be a border. My client is Jerusalem. I love Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be scarred by this agreement. It need not be a wall. It need not be barbed wire. It need not be hugely ugly, but this is going to cut into the skin of Jerusalem. There is a website called, go to Saya Design. These are people that I have worked with who have done mock-ups on what it looks like. It's not the Berlin Wall, but this isn't downtown Paris. And, this is felt most in Europe, where people are saying, look, Jerusalem's going to be shared. No, it's not going to be shared. It's going to be divided. Maybe the old city will be shared. Maybe. And 20 years afterwards, it could be shared. But this won't happen until the playing field is leveled. And the playing field is leveled with a border. And this isn't Sim City. It's Capital City. And capital cities have borders, and those borders are real. And if you don't know what you're up against, you're in the wrong conflict. This is where we're headed.
And what is the URL for that website?
It's sayadesign.
How do you spell
Saya Design. Google it, you'll find it. Saya Design.
Okay.
I never heard of it. Thank you all for being such a terrific audience. I didn't actually introduce myself at the beginning. I always get a bit nervous and forget that. So my name is Lisa Goldman. I actually direct the Israel-Palestine Initiative here at New America. You both did us such an honor coming here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here.